So glad that you're here. We're continuing our series that we started on Easter that we're basically just calling I Can't Even. We sort of have this picture of Jesus looking down at us, the church, sometimes and going, guys, that's not quite it. And we've talked about a lot of difficult subjects. Last week we talked about hypocrisy. There are hypocrites in the church. I noticed that most of you didn't come. That's very interesting. No, actually, I wasn't here either. So I'm a hypocrite because I wasn't here in church on Sunday. So today we're going to talk about a different charge that's really a heavy one, I think. But I found it interesting to sort of research and look into. There's a charge that's leveled against the church and against faith sometimes that is this statement: the church does more harm than good. That the establishment of faith combined with the impact of the faith in the world has actually made the world worse. You might think, well, I mean, who would ever think that? But it's a very often repeated philosophical position that Christianity and even faith in general is a bad thing, that the world has sort of moved beyond the need for faith, that faith was before we had science, or faith was before we had, technology and research, and so you don't really need faith anymore because now you can understand and you can truly see the world as it is. Now, there's a couple of ways to understand. The church has made a lot of missteps over the years. And by the way, when we talk about the church, we're talking about the Christian faith going all the way back to the time of Christ. I don't literally mean like this group of people. If you're guests today, I'm not like selling out this group of people. Like, they've made a lot of mistakes over the years. This is the faith in general going all the way back, okay? Now, we have made a lot of mistakes. There have been things that have happened that, we're not proud of. There's definitely been wars and there's been murder and all sorts of problems. Part of the understanding is very simple, and you can just remember this statement. Saints are sinners too. And there are times that people have done, said, thought, been a part of things that were wrong, that were against the Christian faith. They might have sort of co-opted the Christian name to say that what they were doing is right or to say that what they're doing is God's, but it really was sin. It really was against the Christian faith. And you could really stop there. And you could say, well, then I guess all of the harm that was done by the Christian faith was done by people who were in error, people that were making mistakes. But that's not actually the criticism that we're talking about. The criticism that we're talking about is that Christianity itself, as it is taught and as it is followed, is bad for the world. One scholar of today who's very popular, his name is Richard Dawkins, he said this: the great unmentionable evil at the center of our culture is monotheism, the belief in one God. From a barbaric Bronze Age text known as the Old Testament, 3 anti-human religions have evolved: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He's saying these religions, first of all, he's saying that 3 of them are similar, and that they're all bad for the world as it currently is constituted, as these faiths exist. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the best way I feel like to talk about it is to look at first the actual teachings of Jesus, what he told us to do. Then we can look back into history at 1 or 2 of the things that Christians have really been accused of, especially in terms of the biblical age and then the modern age. And then we'll even talk about today the biggest criticism of the church that exists, and really kind of, look at, how the church, how Christianity has interacted with the culture as a whole. Make sense? All right, so grab a Bible. We're going to be in Mark 12. Mark 12 is one of the readings of this week for Own It. If you're in Own It, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a reading plan. There's about 250 of us here at the church that are reading the same Bible passage every day. We also send out resources a couple of times each week to kind of further you in this study. If you're not doing Own It, it's a great day to start. We start a new book tomorrow. We finished Mark on Friday, so it's a new book tomorrow. So you get a video tomorrow introducing the book of 1 Peter, and then we'll kind of go from there. So here in Mark 12, it's the last week of Jesus' life. I hope you've enjoyed reading the Gospel of Mark. Mark moves very quickly. There's not a lot of connective tissue, not a lot of filler. I mean, all of the Bible is great, don't get me wrong, but Mark itself, it just moves along. It's like the gospel for men. It just keeps moving. There's it just keeps going, and so it's been very fast. You're thinking, Mark 12, that sounds like the middle of a book. No, it's actually almost to the end. I mean, in Mark 12, Palm Sunday has already happened, and Jesus is getting ready for the crucifixion. In Mark 12, Jesus is in the temple, but it's not a service. It's not like this. People would a lot of times be in the temple throughout the day, during the day. Jesus was teaching, and this particular day, this teaching that was recorded by Mark was mostly a debate. It was kind of a Q&A. People would come to Jesus with questions. He would answer. Sometimes they would offer opinions as well. And as you might expect, in a debate, Jesus was doing pretty well. He knows his stuff, he's studied up, he's prayed up, he's ready to go, he's ready to talk. And so Jesus was doing very well in this particular debate. And who was there? The disciples were there, of course. We know that because it was recorded. There's a great crowd there that it says was listening to Jesus with delight. They sort of thought this was fun. It was a good show. And the teachers of the law were there. They tended to ask most of the questions. This was kind of their turf. These temple courts. Now, these weren't the priests per se, but in a way it's very similar to that. They were scribes, they were scholars. And so Jesus was talking to them. And so one of them asks in this question in verse 28. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given a good answer, he asked, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" I think this question is designed to trip Jesus up a little bit. This is an expert in the law saying to Jesus, "So, of all the law, which one is most important?" And of course, picking one law as being more important means you didn't pick another law, so there's a great potential here for offense. There's a great potential to sort of misstep and, say something that would, draw negative attention to yourself. That's really what they're hoping would happen. So they asked Jesus, "Which one is the most important?" Verse 29. "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." So, typical debater, they asked Jesus for one answer and he gave two. It's pretty funny, right? Of all the commandments, which one is the most important? These two. All right, I'll see you there. It's pretty smart. And he sums it up as a law. He said it's very simple. The most important two laws are love God with every single thing that you have and love your neighbor as yourself. This same story is recorded in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, but Luke takes a little bit more time, and he decides to add another detail that Mark left out. In Luke, it says that immediately after Jesus said this, a lawyer, this is not a joke, a lawyer asked Jesus, "All right, so love your neighbor as myself. Who is my neighbor?" I got to find the loophole here somewhere. Who is my neighbor? That's when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. We don't have time to go into that parable today, but it's a story where there's a man who's hurt, and those who should have helped him didn't, and another man who really would have been an enemy of this injured man ended up being the one who helped him. The moral and teaching of that story being, everyone is your neighbor. Right? So Jesus says, all of the law is summed up this way. Love God, love others. Jesus was particularly brilliant in this because the Old Testament law code is unique. There were other law codes in the ancient world. Like you may have heard of Hammurabi's code, for example, which is as old as the Bible. But the Bible has two types of law in it. It has casuistic law and apodictic law. Casuistic law is case law. It's the type of law that we're all familiar with. It's what to do when something happens between people. So the Bible would say, I go to Dan, I need to borrow a burro. You loan me your burro. You have a lot of burros, I know. So you loan me one. While I'm using the burro falls in a ditch that's on my property and breaks his leg. Who needs to pay for the burro? Case law. The Bible would talk about this. By the way, I pay for that burro. It's in the Bible. Oh, and if I ask someone else to watch the burro and the burro dies while they're watching it, well, I'm still responsible because I'm the one who borrowed the burro. So it's all in the Bible, case law. We have tons of case law today in our world. That's what our laws are. Apodictic law is totally different. Apodictic law is the law for how you behave towards God. And Israel's law code was the only one that had this. That there were laws about how you spoke about God, how you used his name, how you sacrificed. If you look at the 10 Commandments, 4 of them are apodictic, okay? This is unique from the ancient world. And so when Jesus sums up the law, he sums up both halves of the law perfectly with these, short little principles to understand. He says, listen, this is how you're supposed to live in this world. Love God, love everybody else. Then, only a few verses later, he launches into this. Verse 38, as he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law." Well, this is awkward because they're here. They're all around us. They're in the crowd. They asked the question. Jesus has this amazing supernatural ability to be totally awkward. Like, really? They're here. Like, you're going to make us all talk about this in front of these people. Okay, fine. Go on. What about these teachers of the law? They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplace and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. Why did Jesus start talking about this 9 verses after he was just talking about the 2 most important laws? He actually is illustrating what he had just taught. He said you need to love God, you need to love others. But what are the religious leaders doing? First thing he talks about is what they're wearing. They're flowing robes. This is not their uniform. He's not criticizing what they wear for work. It's not, if you read the Old Testament, it talks about what the high priest would wear, especially. You might be thinking that. The high priest wore some really fancy stuff. It's not that at all. In the text, it's actually talking about that they were dressed very, very nicely, like any wealthy merchant of the day would have dressed. So if Jesus said, watch out for these teachers of the law, they have, Armani. They're Hugo Boss, whatever your favorite designer is. That's what they wear. They wear the top notch. They drive, I don't know what to say because I don't know what you drive. Whatever you drive, it's nicer than that, okay? I mean, super nice with custom rims. That's what they have, okay? And premium sound and navigation, all right? That's what they want to be noticed. Wherever they go, they are dressed to impress. That's why it says they're recognized in the marketplace. I mean, when they're out shopping, they want people to see them in passing and go, that's a teacher of the law. He's looking good. Then it says they take the most important seats in the synagogue. I didn't really know what that meant, so I looked into it. And it literally says in the Greek, they took the first seats as like a proper noun. And as it turns out, if you go to a synagogue, even to this day, there's going to be an ark on the stage, not the ark, Indiana Jones ark, an ark. It's usually very nice, it's beautiful, it'll be carved. And inside the ark will be the Torah, the scrolls. It's an important part of worship in the synagogue, even to this day. And the first seats were apparently seats that were added to the front of the church, the synagogue, that they would put their chair right in front of the ark. That's where they would sit. So when you came in for worship, came in for teaching, when you were ready to sort of reflect on the icons of your faith, instead, there they sat. Now, icons are not as big a deal in our culture and in our faith, so it's hard to kind of understand what this feels like. But even now, like if I decided to stand on this stool and just stand in front of the cross for the rest of the sermon, like that would be weird. They were doing that as part of their commentary on who they are, even who they are as compared to God himself. Saying, you want to get to God, you go through me. You want to look to God, you look at me. So they're not loving God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. They're taking every opportunity to love themselves. Then it says that they're devouring the homes of widows. This is a huge deal. Jesus just said, love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't even talk about if your neighbor was actually in need. And if you read the Bible, there is a consistent thread. There are two types of people that are really God's favorite. And these same 2 types of people are the people that we are supposed to love and pour into as much as we are able. Do you know those 2 types of people? Somebody knows. Widows and orphans. It's consistent throughout the scripture. You see a widow, you take care of her. You see an orphan, you take care of her. You take care of him. It's consistent in the Bible. So this wasn't just religious leaders not taking care of their neighbor. This was religious leaders not taking care of widows. Now, we don't know exactly what it means that they were devouring their houses. In some way, though, it seems that these widows had a house, which would be a little bit unique. That would be a real saving grace for them, a way that they might be able to safely live on. And somehow the religious leaders were squandering it, and they were taking advantage of this woman in her home, and they were devouring her. It's extremely, problematic in their faith and in our faith to take advantage of someone who's in need. That's exactly the accusation that Jesus laid against the religious leaders. Then he goes on. He says, basically, speaking of widows, verse 41, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on." In those days when you came to the temple to give your offering, there were containers. There were 13 of them. They would be on the ground. It was not inside worship proper like this. There wasn't like a moment of response like we would have where you would come and give your offering. It was in the courts. And these 13 containers each had a dedicated purpose. A couple of them were taxes. The other 11 were different types of things that needed to be paid for in the temple. Some of them were related to your sacrifice. Like in the old code, it would say, for certain types of law, you need to sacrifice 2 pigeons. You could go to the pigeon container and put your money in there, and now you've sacrificed a pigeon. These containers were made of metal. They were small at the bottom, and they got larger going up and then flared out at the top, so they looked like a trumpet, if you can kind of picture that. The Talmud, one of the old Jewish traditional documents, called them the trumpets. When it was time to give, you would go and stand at the trumpets, which, by the way, Jesus said in Luke, when you give, don't trumpet it. He said the pun on purpose. He was talking about this exact thing. So your money is metal. The container is metal. Obviously, what happens here is you come in, when you give your offering, people can hear it. There's a sound that happens. It's not like here in our church, the offering basket passes by very slowly, and you might put something in, you might not. Some of you guys make change. That's a little bit awkward, and then it just kind of keeps going. I'm just kidding. But it wasn't like that. You would come in, if you had a lot of money, you'd have a whole bag of it. You could open it up, and you start to pour it into whichever trumpets you wanted, and it would make sound. People would know. All this craziness. And so if you were good at that, you could make it loud. You would stop and start. People from all around would come and look. They would see you. They would see you standing at the trumpets. They would hear all this sound, and they would know, you brought some serious money to the temple. That's how Jesus knew what this woman had given, because she just walked up to the trumpets and went, plink, plink. That was it. And Jesus said, that's how you learn how to love people. That's how you learn how to love God. And right there in front of him, he gave the 2 examples. You don't live for yourself. You don't take advantage of others. Instead, you give selflessly to make this world a better place. And so, if nothing else, know this. The teaching of Jesus on this is simple. The clear biblical charge from Jesus himself is that Christians should be catalysts for positive change in the world. Say that with me. The clear biblical charge from Jesus himself is that Christians should be catalysts for positive change in the world. So that's the call that we have. So anytime that this criticism might be true, that a Christian is bringing more harm than good into the world, know that we are violating the principles of our teacher, and we need to work to do better. Now, what of history? People love to talk about how the faith has done bad things in history. One of the things they look at is the culture of the Bible. The Bible, especially the Old Testament, was written so long ago. You're talking about the Iron Age of history for most of it. A very, very difficult kind of primitive time to live. You had sorcery, and you had witchcraft, you had animal sacrifice, you had slavery, polygamy, murder. It was a tough time to live. One of the things you have to understand about the Bible is when it comes to culture, the Bible is often descriptive, not prescriptive. Okay? So The Bible may report the news, but not necessarily support the news, okay? So if the Bible says, here are two brothers, they were rivals, they had an argument, this one killed the other. Okay, sounds terrible. That does not mean that today is your brother's last day, right? It's describing something that happened. The Bible, newsflash, is full of sinners. There's only one guy in the whole Bible who wasn't a sinner. The rest made all kinds of mistakes. So just because you see something reported in the culture of the Bible does not mean, well, that's how we're supposed to live today. And so in some ways, society has changed tremendously. But you can't just explain away all of the culture of the Bible. For example, slavery. I would love to talk about slavery in the Bible for a minute. Were there slaves in the Old Testament? Yes, absolutely, there were. Slavery is not a good thing. However, it was different than you might think of slavery right now. First of all, slavery in those days had nothing to do with your race or your ethnicity. That didn't happen at all until really like the last 400 years. Until that, slavery was always based simply on your position in life. And you would become a slave one of three ways. One way would be through war. If a nation would conquer you, they may enslave you. Enslaving people at the end of a war was usually viewed as an act of compassion, because in the ancient world, if you conquered another nation, you would usually just kill them all. So much easier, they never bother you again. Just wipe them out. End of story, you keep the land. Or maybe you wipe out all of the males, not even just the men, the males of all age, and keep the women because, they're just women. This was the ancient world, right? They're not going to bother you. This would be common. So instead, you might enslave people. You might put them to work so that their life could be preserved. Another way would be personal punishment. You guys know that I owe Dan a burro. I don't have an extra burro. That's why I had to borrow it, obviously. If I had a burro, I wouldn't have borrowed a burro. But I don't have the money to pay him back. My wheat field isn't selling very well in the gluten-free climate of the market. So I have problems. So in the ancient world, I would have to be Dan's slave until I had paid off this debt. Indentured servanthood kind of a thing. I owe you a burro, I'm going to work it off. It's not too different from going to prison. Today, if you have a debt to society, they actually call it that, and they will put you into prison where you might make license plates for free. No one has a problem with this. The third type of slavery there were a lot of slaves that were essentially low-class workers. They just were, and I don't want to call them low class, but this is descriptive, not prescriptive, okay? It was a low-class position in life, but you could get work. But it was still different because an Old Testament slave, first of all, the Old Testament had limits of time. There were certain periods where slaves all were freed. You couldn't enslave yourself for life. Also, in Exodus, there's a specific law, I think chapter 23. If you kidnap someone and sell them, that you should be put to death. So it wasn't that kind of slavery at all. There's also talk, let's look at the house of Abraham, for example. Abraham, famous patriarch in the Old Testament, he had tons of slaves. He had a huge, huge entourage. So much so that he and his nephew Lot couldn't live in the same region because they were sort of like wandering kingdoms, okay? Well, when Abraham had no heirs, it was his chief slave who would inherit his estate. Further, when Lot got himself into trouble, Abraham took 318 of his slaves and he armed them with weapons, sent them out as an army to rescue Lot and bring them home. If this was kind of an oppression, captivity-based slavery, would Abraham pass out weapons to the slaves? I don't think so. Also, would they have come back? He just armed them, and if he sent them out to do war, he also gave them food. He just fully equipped them and sent them out. Why would they come back? So it seems to be kind of, a low-class type of work that you could work in. It would be good work. You would be paid. You'd be taken care of. So much so that the Old Testament talks about what to do with your slave if he won't leave. There's provision for this. What do you do if a slave doesn't want to leave? Is that fair? Because the Bible told me I'm supposed to release my slave, but this slave says he wants to work here forever. Then what do I do? The Bible tells you what to do. It's very interesting. In the modern era, slavery got, of course, much more harsh, much more difficult. And it was eradicated essentially 2 times. We're going to count it as eradicated now, although that's a little bit of a stretch. In the Middle Ages, around 1400, slavery was nearly eradicated in Europe, especially coming out of Britain. But when the colonization started, combined with some of the wars, and it sort of built again. And in beating down slavery that first time, it was led by the clergy and the Christians of Europe. It was proclamations from popes. It was donations from wealthy Christians who would buy thousands of slaves and then set them free. They were known for this, that it was Christians who fought against slavery. Here in this country, it was also Christians fighting against slavery. You're saying, no, that's a stretch, Chris, because this is the Bible Belt who kept the slaves. I understand that. This was a little bit of Christian on Christian warfare, unfortunately. The movement to end Christian slavery really started with the Quakers. They did like some very physical, visible demonstration type stuff. And there was some groups of people who vocationally, it was their job to fight against slavery. 75% of them were previously evangelical ministers. And so you can look over slavery, over the history of the world, and you can see that the culture of God's people would be ahead of the culture at the time, sort of pushing against slavery, trying to make it more humane when it had to exist, and then when it didn't have to exist, to eradicate it completely. People also look back in history and they love to talk about the Crusades. You remember the terrible thing the Christians did in the Crusades, right? Everyone knows the Crusades, right? Crusades. I've heard this so many times. I'm like, all right, I'm going to research this for myself. What actually happened in the Crusades? What were these terrible things that the Christians did in the Crusades that I'm still carrying guilt to this day? So this is what happened. There was a time when the Middle East was all Christian nations, Syria, Iraq, Egypt. Soon after Jesus lived, these were all Christian nations. But there was a call to jihad for Islam, and they started to push into these Christian countries. And for 200 years, Islamic fighters slowly encroached upon, North Africa, the Levant, Asia, kind of came up, moving towards Egypt. They took Jerusalem, and they were moving towards a final push into Europe. 200 years. It was at that point that the Christian church said, we have to stop this encroaching into Christian land. We have to push back the Islamic raiders, and the Pope called people to go to war. They weren't sent from a certain country, although a lot of them were British. They weren't sent with resources or weapons. They just went as part of what they viewed to be a holy cause. So you've probably heard there was so much looting in the Crusades. That's kind of true. The armies were self-supported, so they picked up whatever they could along the way. It started nobly with people who just needed to eat, and eventually you might as well keep the guy's castle. And so it kind of went down from there. Then when they got to Jerusalem, it was an actual war. A lot of people died. So now you're talking about Christians killing Muslims over land. So it's not a great thing. And the Christians won the first crusade, and Muslims were pushed out. However, the Muslims came back, and the Christians lost crusade number 2, and they lost crusade number 3. So it was not a great thing. But if you read secular history sources and they talk to you about the Crusaders and that they were bloodthirsty or they were imperial or they were colonial, it's simply not true. They viewed it as pushing back against oppression. They viewed it as trying to make things right. That doesn't mean they were perfect, but it's not nearly the bill of goods that you can be sold by a secular historian that will just call out Christians for this night and day, left and right. There's so many other things you can talk about where you realize when you look into Christianity that Christianity was pushing the culture forward. Let's talk about education. Christians led the charge for universal education. It was very simple. They felt like if you're going to know God, you need to read the Bible. If you're going to read the Bible, you need to know how to read. I will teach you how to read so you can read the Bible. Very simple. Standard missionary move. They've been doing it for almost 2,000 years. They still do it to this day. Then they took it to the next level. The Puritans came here and they said, we could use a good college. So the Puritans were here 6 years and they started a decent school up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, still there today. Harvard. All of the Ivy League soon followed. They were all Christian schools founded on Christian principles. Of the first 123 universities in the United States, only one was secular. The other 122 were Christian schools that teach people about the Bible, teach people God's way. Universal health care came out of a Christian ideal. During the plague, people were dying. Nobody knew what to do. They didn't understand germs. They didn't understand disease. So when you were dying from the plague, they would shove you in the street before you died, hoping you wouldn't infect anyone, and that's where you would die, out on the street. Christians said this is not okay. They started to take those people in. Those people started to fill churches. The Council of Nicaea, sometimes we recite the Nicene Creed on Sunday. It's the long one. It's 3 slides, not 2, right? That same council made another proclamation that said, if you have a cathedral, you have a hospice. Because if you are here to worship, you're also going to care for people. And it was this idea that every person matters that came from the Christian ethic. Science. You've been told that science and religion are at odds, that they run against each other. It's not true. And the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, the attitudes that were rising came out of a Christian ethic. They said, matter is good, matter was created by God, therefore it is good, therefore we should study it. They also said that God is absolute, he's filled with absolute principles, therefore science will be as well. We're going to study science to find its absolute principles. And so there were so many well-known Christian scientists, whether it was Newton or Boyle or Faraday or Kepler. This is what Kepler said. God, like a master builder, has laid the foundations of the world according to law and order. God wanted us to recognize those laws by creating us after his image so that we could share in his own thought. So they pursued science and discovery. Were there missteps along the way? Sure. But the Christian ethic of research gave birth to science. Or what about government? Believe it or not, so much of the way that the world is trying to govern itself today is based in Christian principles. Back to the idea that every person matters, every person is created in the image of God. Read this church father in AD 220. Tertullian said, "It is a fundamental human right, a privilege of nature, that every man should worship according to his own convictions. One man's religion neither harms nor helps another man." You may not want to call it a fundamental human right. You might say we hold these truths to be self-evident, or you might say that these are certain inalienable rights. But the concept of a pure democracy, which we're not nailing, but we're trying, is that every person matters, that they deserve to be heard, they deserve to be protected, they deserve to come together as one people. All of this comes out of a Christian ethic, which all points back to our teacher. Today, what's the greatest charge against the church? Probably tribalism. That the church draws people into groups, separates people one to another. But Christianity is the most radically inclusive movement that the world has ever known. Doesn't matter if you have a bunch of money or if you're broke. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Doesn't matter your ethnicity, your race. Doesn't matter what your parents did or do. It doesn't even matter what you've done in your own past. Christianity calls all of those people together, and you only have to do 2 things to be a Christian. Love God with all you've got. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the legacy of the Christian faith. And you and I have the opportunity to join and be a part of that legacy. The reason that the church has been able to impact the world is because they came together and as best they could in sometimes frail or broken or flawed ways, as best they could, they came together to pursue the teachings of Jesus and the way that he's told us to be in this world. And so I would say just think through 2 ways that you could do this. First one, seek to have a local impact. Look around your world, your sphere that you live in, what's happening here on your street and in your block. How can you have an impact in that world? We do a lot of things here at the church, sort of official programs for local impact. Those are great. A coat drive, a school backpack drive that's going to be happening, all this sort of thing. And those are all great things. They're also a little bit of training wheels for you, sort of like these are the types of things that we do. Because if someone on your block is sick, you should just make them a meal and you should mow their lawn. We don't need a program for that. We don't need a ministry for that. That's what we do. That's what we're called to do by Jesus. And so it's our privilege to really, step out and honor him in those ways. And besides local impact, I would encourage you to have global impact. And I'm so excited that Carrie is here today because we are just teeing this thing up for you because you can right now today join with the church and its history and everything that's happened by choosing to have an impact globally. Carrie said it's the number one, preventable death in the world is clean water. And there are hundreds of millions of people who don't have it. I've had the privilege of running 5 times. This year I'll be running number 6. And every time I'm excited to see how God can use it to further his kingdom. And I think many of you might want to consider it as well. It's a great, great opportunity to be demonstrating who the church is called to be to the world at large. So can we pray? God, thank you for your word. We're excited today to look at Mark 12 and be reminded of kind of the fundamental essence of the biblical word. We should love you with everything we have and love everyone else the same. God, I ask for forgiveness. There are so many times when I don't do that. So many times that I mess up. And I know my friends here have done the same. And I pray that you would cleanse us of that. You would allow us to approach you with hearts that are pure. And I pray that you would be equipping us every single day for how we can have your impact in this world. And so I thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen.